Maybe we can just go briefly over what we talked about yesterday regarding Monroe Price's arguments, um, where he's essentially pointing out that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the world information order has changed. Okay? Now, for his own purposes, he doesn't want to put it in those terms because then he has to say what the old information order was, and he finds it inconvenient to do that. Right? Instead, he just says, okay, now we have, I think he says right at the outset, in a time of global media interconnections, practices of broadcasting or of the internet in one state affect the political and legal climate of other states. So, I mean, that was always true, presumably, but it becomes more true. It is a truth that gains in intensity after the end of the Cold War, you could say, and so that gives him his point of departure. And we've discussed various approaches that he takes. So his unit of analysis is the nation state. Yeah, although the context is a changing world order, he looks at the unit, individual nation state, which then allows him to make certain arguments and forecloses other, other insights become a little harder to achieve. And we've noticed that, yeah? But he's talking about the division of national responses to the complexity of information inflows that have two categories or types. Yeah? The state efforts to protect its own information space, its own bubble of identity. Again, it's interesting to say this word bubble, it's a way of thinking about identity which is much more ephemeral and would be much less acceptable, some years earlier. But in the time he's writing, it can go without question. And he points to this effort by a state or states to influence media space outside its own borders. Yeah, so it's a broad categorization here. He also proceeds to talk about space and place. So these are certain biases that we noted in his approach to the questions. Yeah. Okay, look at this. By space, I refer to a model of activity that assumes transmission of images can occur in a manner impervious to imposed public parameters or sanctions. Here, law is removed to a set of principles only, a virtual admission that the ordinary machinery of government is ineffective. So it's a wild zone. It's like the high seas. It's like where piracy was legal in the 17th century. It's akin to that. Yeah. In this new configuration of transmission, there seems to be neither a fixed locus for enforcement, a set of rules to be enforced. This idea of space captures a dream or nightmare where individuals, groups, etc. are unfettered by regulation in the distribution of images throughout the globe. So that is absolutely lawless, and as a lawyer, one would presume he wants to bring order to it, but his approach is by focusing on the individual nation states without talking about the power differences across nation states, which is again a resort of convenience that Monroe Price utilizes. Yeah. Right. And as he proceeds with his argument, he elaborates on this sort of movement between the nation as a pillar of, order and the international space, where there has to be sort of a multilateral approach where different parties come together and negotiate, so forth. Now we'll sort of move to the second part, which we left out last time, yesterday, We'll approach that part now. Just noting here, Monroe's Price's point, there is a transformation of the rights language in the zone of media. Yeah? That since the 1990s, the assertion of speech rights has been tightly linked to the rising influence of private media corporations, companies seeking to minimize government regulation of media enterprises marshal speech rights most effectively. And this will lead into our discussion of Jacques Maritain, Herbert Schiller today, which is uncovering the sort of longer history of this question of speech rights, how it became so influential, and how the wrong people, so to say, took most advantage of it. Yeah, and he makes this very clear statement: human rights principles are used to clear a global space for commercial media. Yeah? And it's not just media, it's private actors of all kinds. And that development is, of course, followed by other developments, such as the Citizens United case, in the United States, where free speech is equated with money. So that when a donation is made to a political party, to restrict that donation, the amount of the donation is ruled by the Supreme Court to be equivalent to abridging a person's right of free speech. Yeah? And that, of course, as President Carter has and others have noted, is essentially the death of democracy. Yeah? Essentially the death of democracy. But the death of democracy can take a long time. So, I think only the second time in which he uses this term Cold War, this is in the concluding chapter, Monroe Price says, during the Cold War, the West, mainly the United States, it says the West, used human rights doctrine to justify international broadcasting that violated state borders by saying that these transmissions were fulfilling the right of individuals to receive information. Yeah? This is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, but the Soviet Union, all parties were really doing it. They were jamming each other's signals. So the battle went on in different ways. And as he says, sometimes the conflicts did not restrict themselves to jamming signals. They could extend to armed conflict. And then there are national responses. Sorry, this is not so clear, but this is table 9.2 in the text, where he is listing national responses to these challenges. And he lists 4 here. The justifications for restrictions. They may make justifications for restrictions. Nations may also restrict the kind of communication technology that is available. They may fasten on to specific objects of restriction, it could be a physical or a cultural object of restriction. And he includes another point, which is that the intensity of restriction can also vary. Yeah? The severity with which rules are applied can obviously vary. And he elaborates here that there are methods of implementation of national responses to the challenges of globalization of information, which means loss of control for the nation state over its information environment. It says it all comes down to means of implementation. And some of the techniques he's elaborating here: domestic laws of censorship, negotiation and invocation of international human rights laws, and maybe from the Indian context we would have some discussion about this. Human rights very often has become a kind of epithet directed against those who are critical of any existing state practice, right? It's associated with foreign powers, illegitimate use of influence by foreign powers. George Soros, whoever it is, may be invoked here. Truly, the influence attributed to George Soros is astounding. manipulation of laws governing the allocation of spectrum, use of laws providing for licensing broadcasting stations, design of the architecture of signal reception. So, in other words, highly technical aspects of the media context can be used to restrict communication possibilities in ways that users may not be aware of at all. And that is the point. Intervention through technical assistance and even bombing. Rather cryptic, yeah, but of course, as an Israeli, he knows what he's talking about. Bombing Palestine every day for 75 years. The final way of passing these techniques in terms of evaluating, predicting, or understanding national responses is to assign them to one of four categories: adopting law, entering into negotiations, implementing technology, or engaging in the use of force. But there are deep conceptual difficulties with this form of categorization. Law, for example, can itself be said to be a form of force. Negotiation is often the consequence of the exercise of power. Yeah? So these categories absolutely blur into each other. They have to be taken together as a context, discussed as part of a context, and the tendency to separate them and to address them individually can be deeply distorted. So here he says, the line between technology and law, as Lawrence Lessig has famously reminded us, is increasingly fine. This is from Lessig's book Code, where he suggests code is law. Yeah, that computer code regulates conduct in cyberspace, more or less as how legal code regulates behavior in the physical world. In addition to the use of law, force is used both internally and without. And he talks about information intervention. Okay? Information intervention. So again, it's a studiously neutral term. You could say manipulation, you could say propaganda, but this is the term he utilizes to alter media content within a country where uncontrolled information flow is thought to be inconsistent with multilateral objectives. It's just really hard to know. It could apply to absolutely anything. Yeah, jamming, monitoring, bombing of offending broadcasting outlets, seizing control of transmitters to prevent conflict-producing media are the stuff of this emerging practice. Yeah, so in other words, we have truly entered a wild zone, and it is getting wilder by the day, we might say. There is an even more pervasive term. We have seen that one modern response of states is to replicate the old system and ensure that, to the extent possible, information is funneled through regulatable intermediaries. But if information leaks around intermediaries, then the next step will be to try to regulate the content providers. They too are elusive in the internet era. Content providers are elusive. The result may be increased emphasis on regulating the ultimate user, a crude return to punishment of the consumer, the citizen, the subject. In highly organized and religious societies where there are intense community pressures, peer observation and reporting becomes a prelude to a social enforcement tool. Sounding rather prophetic, yeah? Understanding that the potential for highly intensive forms of coercion lurk within the very nature of the new technological context that is taking shape. And this is absolutely without respect to questions of place. Okay? Governments can construct an information version of Star Wars defense to block out unwanted images. They seek to control information by alliances, secret or otherwise, with the purported owners of means of distribution. It will be important to analyze the shift from traditional regulatory modes, such as censorship and criminal prosecution, to regulation that is rooted in identification and control of flows of information. So this is the shift to uh, what Matteo Pastrinelli has called societies of metadata. States exult in burying value choices in the neutral pitch of unfathomable code and the complexities of system architecture. Yeah? So here he's essentially referring to the ideal of transparency, which is always accompanied arguments about information flow, and pointing out that transparency is not much use if, in fact, the providers of information are able to obfuscate the meaning or deter comprehension through utilization of expert languages which are not accessible yet to the general population. Yeah? In the new technologies, it is a design of code that often is the prelude for the potential and the desire of the state to regulate. Here, I mean, you're all, I'm sure, aware of statements made at various times by people in positions of influence that data is the new oil. The turn to software provides the infrastructure for ideology, not ideology itself, and has become a significant factor in regulation. So, saying essentially, the question of ideology becomes more complicated when we have stratification with, so to say, data and metadata, where the metadata actually gives you identifying attributes and enables you to address messages to highly specific targets in a way that again deepens the blurring of wartime and peacetime forms of communication. Yeah? The architecture of rating and filtering will be an approach of choice, not only in authoritarian societies, but also in those states that are committed to private broadcasting, sealing deregulation. Very curious, interesting idea here. Ideas in the future may be required to have identity cards or passports, the form of technical meta-information that can determine where such ideas can travel, to whom they can be addressed, by whom they can be received, how much they may cost to access, whether they should be banned entirely. Now, not clear how one would distinguish an idea from other forms of information so sharply as he's implying here, but what he's indicating, I think, very clearly is the capacity for control is deep, it's deeper than anything one had imagined before, right? It exceeds any form of control, surveillance and control system that had been conceptualized in the past. And again, it's coming out quite, quite smoothly here. It may seem eccentric to suppose that ideas will have passports, but consider the notion against the background of history. One of the purposes of national control over personal movement across borders was to limit disturbances to the status quo and control against the hazards of dissent and subversion. In a simpler world, limiting movement of people performed the task of limiting the movement of ideas. Yeah? Take away their passports, ban them, expel them from countries, so forth. On the side of technology, the impetus of states and of corporations has been to move to the kind of tagging of content with meta-information that allows ideas to be filtered and restricted in ways similar to the methods used to restrict free travel across boundaries of individuals. It does not take much imagination to put these two trends together. Okay, so here we find this leaning towards information as the solution, not the solution, the way to ameliorate violence, way to render war, a non-violent process in some sense. So we see training encompasses the idea that in an information society, military operations, like those of governments and corporations, should be constantly working to affect perceptions and loyalties. General Wesley Clark, responsible for much of the Kosovo campaign, in a post-conflict speech, suggested that information war, earlier commenced and effectively conducted, might have been preferable to the bombing campaign that was actually implemented. But rather than blowing off their head, you tell them things, and maybe that will modify their conduct in the ways you want to, and then a great deal of pain can be spared. Achieving information dominance over an adversary will decide conflicts long before resort to more violent forms of warfare is necessary. Much of PSYOPs is contingent on new technology, though the monitoring aspect of military strategy has developed more than the transmission side. So much work needs to be done here. And I just want to say this is like soft power, folks. This is like soft power, where you're persuading people. And as we know, there are different ways to alter people's stances on any position. One is intimidation, one is persuasion, one is, ranging from outright force to banning, to making the choice that authorities seek to deter more difficult, to rendering it unthinkable. So persuasion is only one of many, many options. And I think increasingly, as we are all entering this new environment, we are all getting a taste of how it feels to be in such an environment. Wherever we are in the world, we're experiencing the meaning of this information warfare as it sinks into the very roots of our society. The development of PSYOPs, including anti-terrorism efforts and cyber warfare, is part of an information policy that is rarely transparent, yet it will become an increasingly significant aspect of the way in which one society seeks to shape the information and media space of another. And here the figure of the NGO is brought up, that NGOs recognize that in a world where regulation is less effective than before, as a mode of affecting imagery, positive intervention is often necessary. Now, I want to pause here on this category of the NGO, non-governmental organization. Where and when does it come up? What is the term we all know? We know people in it. Maybe we have worked in NGOs. I myself have. But it's a new term. It's a relatively new term. It does not have a long history. And like so many other terms in the post-World War II period, they come without discussion and suddenly they are everywhere. They are absolutely everywhere. So that it seems unnecessary to ask, because everybody knows apparently what it is. But what is it? Non-governmental organization. Yeah? So the late Rajni Kothari had used to make fun of it, saying that we can speak about GONGOs, government organized, non-governmental organizations. Yeah? And so that brings up one kind of irony about it, which is it has to be sanctioned and allowed, funding has to be permitted, its operation must be, legal, and then it is then called non-governmental. Media are often key to the way in which political practices are legitimated. If the nature of media changes, then those ultimate practices become subject to challenge as well. In a way, it's saying that everything is really up in the air. Everything is really up in the air. When Donald Trump says, they're going to buy Greenland, and if Denmark says no, they will have to pay the consequences. Okay, so, or Elon Musk says, Keir Starmer had better quit because I believe all the stories about him. Now, neither of them are making. They're all throwing out ploys. They're essentially showing how they can thoroughly rattle the international environment and giving the signal that everything is now, off the table in terms of your old assumptions. So Monroe Price returns to this notion of the nation state as his, again, the basic unit of his analysis, that it requires the creation of a collective identity, a symbolic web of shared beliefs, values, and norms. And I guess that is something that deserves discussion at this time. We are in a more globalized world than ever before. The difficulty of disentangling our local affiliations and insisting on them as being sovereign, as being impregnable, as requiring to be purified, requiring to be upheld over other affiliations, identities, becomes much more challenging and requires the application of much more force than was previously necessary. So the question becomes, how much force is justified or advisable in the maintenance of our sense of place, some sense of a stable ground upon which we live? How much, can we insist on that? And how much should we think about an international space in which we obviously live? A globalized world for which apparently no symbolism is required. No, but we do require it. Here we all are. I may be living there, you may be here, we're able to talk together. So what is the symbolic space we share, and how do we understand it as something that should be nurtured, can be built upon, that is not exclusive to what our geographical residence is, but would enable each of us to engage beyond our given spheres? Is that not what we all want? Yeah, so I find Monroe Price's insistence on place and nation deeply reactionary here, deeply reactionary, yeah, and certainly requires questioning. Right, okay. Then I wanted to say a bit about Herbert Schiller. Shall I just do that? So this is the last slide I have on the Monroe Price, from the Monroe Price book. There's new media giants, new regional alliances, new geopolitics, all conspire in the remapping of information space. The defining interactions of image and society may be in technological flux, but the issues that underlie them never disappear. Okay, so he mentions the issues of geopolitics, but obviously he's not going to say what the US is doing or should do. He takes a kind of apparently neutral stance. And now I want to go back in time a bit, and for that I've assigned the Herbert Schiller essay, which it's simple enough. There's not much complexity to it, but I just have 5 slides of some information I've excerpted from there, which I'll share with you. It was obvious that the fundamental premise of free enterprise, namely access to capital, governs access to message dissemination, that this fundamental premise of free enterprise would be intolerable to societies which had eliminated private ownership of decisive forms of property, such as mass communications facilities. Yeah? So he's laying out the basis for the Cold War logic of free flow of information that was propounded by the United States. They saw this as a guarantee of eroding the authority of communist societies. And what is interesting is that a number of studies coming out in the 90s confirmed, without referring to this principle of free flow of information, essentially confirmed this argument that the reason for the dissolution of the Soviet Union had a great deal to do with the barrage of media that they were not able to ward off, that they had to absorb, and the effects of that over time led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That argument has been made, for example, by Gladys Ganley. I think some books she co-authored with her husband, but also a book by herself. Gladys Ganley, Ganley, but also someone, a Soviet anthropologist, former Soviet anthropologist, Yurchak, Alexei Yurchak, Yurchak, which is a much more sophisticated anthropological argument, essentially that what happened in the Soviet Union was, it was not the case that people lost their faith or belief in communism, because it was, there was a positive belief there. This is something that many other people have stressed, that when fighting the Cold War, the United States had hatred of their enemy. They argued that their enemy was evil and needed to be destroyed or eliminated. What was a positive belief on the US side other than an expression of freedom? It was actually, there was a lack of positive belief. This point has been made by somebody like Norbert Wiener in his book, The Human Use of Human Beings. I urge you to take a look at it, because his discussion of this is very powerful. That if you take away the element of belief, then you do not understand what you are fighting. You take away the element of belief. Your own side is hollowed in terms of its adhesion to the values, whereas the other side, you are misunderstanding them, you are mistaking them for something that they are not. Their value system is actually stronger than you imagine. Now, of course, they ran into problems. I don't want to get into all of that, but what Alexei Yurchak argues in his book that is titled Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. Everything was forever until it was no more, which Slavoj Žižek gave a very nice blurb to. What he says is that, people believed in those values, they took them seriously, but over time what happened in the Soviet Union was another realm of media developed, which was samizdat, the underground, rock music, illicit publications, blue jeans, Western practices of various kinds, but these could coexist quite comfortably with each other, right? You might go to the Communist Party, you put your vote for whatever you're supposed to vote for, like everybody else, you all voted for the same thing, but that didn't mean you did not have belief, okay? It was like any other association where we are all used to, okay, what is everybody else doing? You put your hand up, it was a kind of consensual belief in a way. But once Stalin died, Stalin was the authoritative producer of communist discourse in a way. After he died, there was no one to replace that role. Therefore, the Stalinist discourse took on a kind of life of its own. It continued to exist, reproduced through party organization, but it could not withstand glasnost. It could not withstand glasnost. So once glasnost came and Gorbachev mistakenly assumed that by giving more freedom, you would actually democratize the society, what happened was that it could not retain its integrity thereafter. So so that's the kind of more nuanced argument that we have about this, the effect of free flow of information in different contexts, and we could say that some of that argument can be said to apply to India also. We did not have a communist party, but if we look at the way in which information climates changed following that liberalization, with the advent of market liberalization, there are striking similarities in the shift from the Nehruvian to the post-Nehruvian historical context. So, in a way, it's what the American model gives us, which is the model that became most influential, is market-centric. What the Soviet model gave us was a model that was state-centric. Now, that state-centric model is a model that illuminates inquiry into all state-centric contexts for that period, not only those that were in the communist orbit. Yeah, so I urge you to think about the parallels, which can be quite illuminating. Herbert Schiller goes on that Western governments were concerned about Soviet influence, and therefore they were willing to support the United States even if they disagreed with the ideas and opposed commercial penetration of the United States. He points out that there were criticisms of this free flow doctrine even within the United States. There is one record from the 1947 period where they ask for a focus on the quality of communication. Yeah, they said it's not just enough to allow free flow, we have to pay attention to the quality, but every time the question of quality was raised, the objection would be raised, that means censorship. Okay, and so that would be used to effectively kill any demands for monitoring content in terms of quality. And this confidence on the part of the United States that they were a democracy that could not be shaken. They were a democracy that had achieved their full flower and would be a model for the rest of the world, and any amount of free flow of information could not alter their democratic structure. That was, in retrospect, we can say an utterly foolish belief, but even people like Eleanor Roosevelt are on record saying, this is our system and we are going to stand by it. We want free flow. Other countries must also have free flow. So that has been, I think, a crucial development in bringing us to where we are today. And Schiller points out that this demand for quality was also raised by the Hutchins Freedom of the Press Commission in 1946. And I just want to mention that because this is a very important report. So when Henry Luce wrote his essay, The American Century, he also funded an investigation into the state of the press in the United States. And it was the committee that was formed was really all highly eminent thinkers across a range of fields. It included Harold Laswell, it included Jacques Maritain, whose essay we are also looking at, and their report was vilified in the press. It was vilified, and Henry Luce himself disavowed it. But one recommendation they made was very influential and was carried forth, and that was that the study of media and the training of journalists must not be a vocational effort in the universities. Communication must rise to the level of a full-fledged discipline on par with the established disciplines. Yes, and a decade later, Harold Laswell, who, as I said, had been a member of this commission, wrote saying that in Europe they are too rigid, they are not able to do this, but United States, we have been able to do it, and all over the country we have departments of communication, schools of communication. And so the study of media, or if you like, media studies, was in this sense, this guy's decades ahead in the United States compared to Europe. Okay? Now, that has to be qualified because there were traditions of newspaper studies in Germany, there were studies of traditions of communication inquiry in France, but the American model actually became more influential than all of those. They influenced and reshaped the study of media in all of those contexts, and certainly in India, I would say the American model has been most influential. Yeah, so but since we are all, I assume, students of communication in some way, it's also interesting to think about what was the reception of the Indian Academy to this arrival of a new American discipline in the 50s and 60s, 70s. What was the reception? And that's a subject which I think deserves study. It's not well documented, but just one has to glean, hints from different places. The word communication was a very sexy word. That was for quite a while. One can see that in the way it was used by different scholars. Shyamacharan Dubey, who was the head of the Institute for Advanced Study in Simla, various other people using the word, but not invoking the field or the discipline. By and large, the Indian academic scholars treated communication as kind of intellectual dumping. Yeah, they were suspicious of it. They were resisted it. They did not open, I don't think, in most places you did not find departments of communication, etc. It really took 30, 40, 50 years for that to actually happen. Yeah, you had the Indian Institute of Mass Communication in 1965, but that became a government organization, training government officers, and quite limited in its reach, really. So as a result, the communication revolution was propagated in countries like India, but the intellectual kind of people did not think about it very much. They were suspicious about it, they poo-pooed it, they made fun of it, but they did not take it seriously. It appeared to be sort of existing in a kind of policy domain, business class lounges and, air-conditioned conference rooms, and they could not see it as something to be thought about in the Indian context. What does it mean to have, an information revolution? How do you conceptualize that? What is its meaning in the Indian context? And that is if you're interested in a research topic, I would suggest to look for Indian language discussions of, whatever, Suchna Kranti, or different names it went by. What were the debates about it? Surely there were debates. Surely the English language was where there was least debate, because that's already a sold out group of people, already inclined to be aligned with the West. It would be in the Indian language debates where questions would be asked, and that would potentially be an interesting field to explore. Yeah, right. So now I'll talk about the Jacques Maritain and that declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Maritain was a Catholic philosopher, highly regarded. He became the ambassador for the French government to the Vatican, so he took his Catholicism very seriously. I should say, and you may be knowing this, the Catholic Church took communication very seriously too. It was their word. Propaganda was a Catholic word, belonged to the Catholic Church. So if you look even in India, where were there institutes, schools of communication? Very often they would be in Xavier's College, they would be in the Christian colleges, they would have centers for communication, which they saw as a way of spreading the word. And the word is, of course, in the beginning was the word, and this is it's a religious kind of understanding. Yeah, so it was both. It came from outside, And probably the churches were most important in trying to indigenize or domesticate it. But as far as I know, that's not a well-examined subject at all. Now, the argument that Jacques Maritain makes is that we have, there are so many different philosophies, so many different cultures, that we can never engage in an intellectual argument about it and arrive at a conclusion. We are sure to end only in disagreement. What we must do, therefore, is to simply say there are rights that all of us need, and we can agree that these are rights. The only discussion is, what are the rights that we need to protect? That is the discussion we need to have. What are the rights we need to protect? How shall we protect them? Yeah, so maybe the how received less attention. Now, in that list, Article 19 is the one I find most interesting. Let me see if I can find it. About. Get involved. Read the declaration. Here we are. Whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. Whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations. Whereas the people of the UN have reaffirmed their faith in the fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, the equal rights of men and women, determined to promote social progress and better standards of life. Now, therefore, we proclaim this Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations, to the end that every individual, every organ of society, keeping this declaration constantly in mind, shall strive by teaching and education to promote respect for these rights and freedoms, and by progressive measures secure their universal and effective recognition and observance. And it goes on. All human beings are born free, etc. All are entitled to the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration. Okay, so now in the wake of World War II, of course, that was the crisis in a way that they were responding to, that large numbers of people were declared to be stateless. And if you did not have a state to protect your rights, what rights did you have? Yeah, so the Declaration of Human Rights is stepping into what it sees as a void, that there are people who are being expelled by their states or deprived by their states of their rights that they were born with, and so there has to be some kind of safety net. In a way, this is the kind of safety net. But who is to exercise these? Who is to say, someone's rights are being violated, they have to be protected? How do you do that? Well, that how is actually the trickiest part of the story, because in fact these rights were often observed in abeyance, and the ways in which these rights, when they were protected, often required military intervention with all kinds of collateral damage. Yeah? So this topic has been the subject of a lot of interesting argument and debate. Hannah Arendt, Jacques Rancière and others. So that would be a separate class. The rights that are being propounded here cannot be regarded as meaningless, nor should they be regarded as merely empowering military intervention. They have to be seen as understood as involving people more generally, right? That anyone should be able to think of themselves as participating in this act of protection. Yeah? So in a way, it's conceiving, before it exists, a global public sphere for which a global government does not as yet exist. Yeah? So it's pointing to the fact that globalization is creating a community of people who are aware of a world far beyond their given nation, who are aware of the global character of their existence, but there is no political authority that corresponds to this global aspect of their existence. And the UDHR is in a way acknowledging that gap and marking that spot, sort of inviting solutions to that problem, as it were. Yeah? Now, in this list, as I said, I think it's Article 19. Yeah, here we are. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Okay, so, and in some iterations of this, it becomes even more clear that it is information itself that requires protection, whose flow requires protection, etc. Yeah, so this is, I think, buried deep in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, something that essentially reiterates what was already conceived as an American ideology, free flow of information, and it has been a potent weapon. It has been a potent weapon. The way in which it manifested eventually was in terms of human rights. You could say, you know, if the question of rights did get politicized during the Cold War, it was in terms of human rights. And that happened in the 1970s. And Samuel Moyn has written an interesting book about it, Last Utopia. I'll just say a little bit about that, which is that what happened during the Cold War was that, and here he's talking about the American society, American intellectuals, but I think it has a larger implication. Certainly it applies to India as well, which is that the fear of communism, the distaste for communism, the sense that communism represented a negative example that could not be defended, affected the entire left. So in a sense, if you claimed to be left or even liberal, you had to disavow communism. You had to disavow it. You often even had to denounce it. Yeah? Now, you can say that's fine, you know, nobody wants to support Stalinism, nobody wants to support the Gulag, but the problem was that it became a permanent problem that they had to constantly apologize for, overcome. It was a permanent weakness. It was an Achilles heel of the left. Actually, it was an Achilles heel of liberals in general. And Sam Moyn points out that during the Cold War, liberal intellectuals came to the view that they can support the American society and really distance themselves from traditional goals, arguments that had been made, you know, by their intellectual forebears, so that when the fall of communism came, 1989, 1991, when that moment came, the moment perhaps that they had all been dreaming about, okay, the evil empire had come to an end, what was their program for their own society? They had nothing to say, right? Their positive ideas for their society were lacking and essentially were taken over by neoliberal advocates for the market. Similarly, one could say in the Indian context, widespread delight in the fall of the Soviet Union within Indian liberal quarters failed to see that the demise of the Soviet Union would have a catastrophic effect on the composition of the political sphere in the Indian context. Yeah? And they've paid the price for that. As it happens, the Finland was quite important in their interventions in this whole debate, because you had studies carried out there which showed that overwhelmingly the media exports were dominated by US exports. And they concluded that this is one-way flow of information, which leads to the imposition of the ideas of one country over all others, and that should be resisted. And it was very difficult to refute that. Now, what's interesting is just a couple of years before, the Latin American economists in the United Nations had said, you talk about free market, but what free market is doing is it's giving us low prices for our raw materials and high prices for the finished goods you're returning to us. This is in the name of development, you are actually impoverishing us. And so we need a new world economic order. The new world economic order, the demand for that led to the formation of the United Nations Council on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. Yeah, and the demand for a new world information order caused panic, and it led to a vicious campaign of counter propaganda and slander. Highly vicious. New York Times, all of these media were involved in that. Yeah, and there's extensive documentation of the campaign as well. This demand, however, revitalized, or it vitalized communication studies, it has to be said, especially in Europe, countries like India. Many of the early scholars in communication, I think, came into, began to research and publish in the context of these debates, yeah, where they were keenly aware of global imbalance, they were keenly aware of the need for some sort of national effort to create sustainable information environments. The problem was that they all required state assistance, they required funding, and they required sympathetic policies, and in most cases those were wanting. Yeah, so communication studies very often became kind of a litany of failed projects, promises not fulfilled, dreams not realized, and so forth. And because they were so heavily dependent on the government, they were not able to criticize the government. That was difficult. So very often you have to read against the grain, it's my sense. Dr. Reddy can also speak to this. Yeah, speak again. You have to, it's kind of really in diminuendo. Yeah, it's you have to pick it up, but it's not stated openly. But this, as you say, was part of NAM, non-aligned movement, and it was one of its most important achievements to put this on the sort of intellectual map for the world to ponder over, that there was this imbalance of information that had to be addressed somehow. But what has happened after that, I guess, standing back and looking at, rather than going to the details of the policy responses, there has been a sort of, it is more multipolar, certainly. Information flow, India is one pole or one node, you could say. China, Hong Kong are other poles. Egypt, Turkey, there are other nodes of media production and circulation. So the American dominance is much less than what it used to be. That gives rise to a subsequent question: what about the forms of American communication? Do the forms, the styles, the patterns, the ways in which communication itself is conceived, do they influence the content of what is being produced in this multipolar order? And to some extent the answer is yes. To some extent the forms have survived, whereas the content has changed. Yeah. So we can look at, for example, the Korean show Squid Game, which is the most successful show ever on Netflix, and all these remarkable statistics around it. If you look at the form of Squid Game, it is very much a marriage of South Korean and American cultural forms. Yeah, and the emphasis on violence in Squid Game, which was completely anathema to the Korean context, was made possible because of Netflix sponsorship. Against the none of the South Korean media companies were willing to accept it. The Americans insisted on it, and so that was. And what does it show? It shows the devastated landscape of South Korea after the Korean War, where civil society has been reduced to a shambles, and market forces drive people to the kind of desperation depicted in the show. Yeah, so it's truly a grim picture. You don't read it as cultural imperialism, but in a way, it's the result of decades of a certain kind of domination, where the United States certainly has played a part. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of you are aware that in Korea, the script itself changed, so that people who were born who used to be able to read the script of 1972, 73, by the late 70s, the script had changed. So it has rendered the history of that society unavailable to people living there. That is the extent of deculturation that happened there by the South Koreans themselves. You can't blame anybody else. Yeah, but they did that in a context, yeah, which was that of the Korean War.
But in your remarks, you also spoke about Geo.
Mm.
And obviously, when Geo they wanted to do expansion. So majority of the stakes are from the American firms. And similarly, another digital platform which was booming was Paytm. And then it had to face government strike because majority of the investment from Chinese government, Alibaba Corporation.
Yes.
So that way, when it comes to government response to certain organization, then ultimately whose investments have come and from what part of the region they have come, that also plays an influential role.
Absolutely, quite right. Did you have a question? Yes.
So I'm also thinking in terms of how the information flow has also worked between the citizens and the people and state. That free flow of information and exchange. Because that time also, sir, it was drastically changing before technology. Remember when anti-Iraq protests were happening. What I'm trying to say is how the meaning of information was also changing. That when anti-Iraq protests were happening against Bush. So, of course, those protests were not covered by the media. And then there was another medium to where this protest was shown. But at the same time, Bush never responded to those protests. Because that was also interesting how, and then it is what was in the medium was not shown not reflected in the form of the protest or other side, but it was just as a form of opinion. Take as a form of just an opinion.
Private opinion.
Yeah. But later when technology was also changing and this communication network forms were changing. So now that information is first if we go that there's a sender receiver. Now that information is not in just a sender receiver.
Yes.
Now it's just floating in there. Either and it still exists, or maybe it's changed now. But I'm here against just talking in 2008 or 9. There is no sender, there is no receiver. The information is just floating here. So I want to understand that.
Well, someone produces it, someone circulates it. So it's not without infrastructure. Infrastructure presumes something, But I guess you're saying that, there is a sort of information can be received in a way that we feel it is totally disembodied. That's what you're saying. Yeah. But we may be encountering information that has a provenance, has a genealogy. We are not aware of its genealogy, but that doesn't mean it does not exist. The challenge would be to locate that. Where is it coming from? You know. I mean, I think what you're pointing to is the fact that the natural environment itself has now become populated by media in a way that it is hard to disentangle the two. You know, in that sense, there's a kind of blending of the cultural and the natural kind of technologization of the environment is something we've come to experience as a second nature. It's a second nature, and that renders the task of understanding it much harder. The task of stepping aside from it and giving it a kind of analytical gaze becomes much more difficult. Is that what you're thinking about?
And also maybe the technology always dematerializes things. That's
Yes,
what we are
indeed.
looking at. And
Indeed.
culture is always more towards the artifacts and all. There is some kind of a product which is always there. So when aligning these two, it's also important to look at how technology and the information is now more service oriented than the product oriented.
Right.
So therefore it becomes very interesting to see its tangible versus intangible natures
right.
of culture as well as the information we are talking about.
Indeed, yes.
All the information is more service oriented now. Look at the
Yes.
services which is any technical companies right now is the information. Apple, for example, is like one important store is there, but look at Amazon, for example. The products are there, but they still have Amazon Prime, existence of information flow. So it's very interesting. The South Korean company like Samsung also, I always feel, the kind of empire they created, the products are there, but the services which they are producing is more predominant in the information. So there, I think aligning this cultural imperialism with information flow will come into a kind of a play.
Right, right. I mean, it has to be said also that the arguments about cultural imperialism belong to a certain time, and today they don't. That seems a little too heavy-handed for I mean, each of us is now doing our own whatever it is. We can't point to some big bad entity far away. That's so. In that sense, it's become much more fine-grained. But I think, what Dr. Reddy is saying about the real and the virtual and the increasing virtualization of the real, maybe that's another way of thinking about the disembodied information you're talking about.
It is just like one step more further, because when there's a word information, there's also comes word knowledge. When I'm saying that how the words of the like this is changing. And so like, because when I ask my students what is information, they say knowledge, and so again, like when I talk about it in the first day, like of course there we are living in the times, never in the history there has been this much of communication, but at the same time, like again we are living in the times where never this much information was existed, like so that too much information also in itself killing the knowledge also. But like I always wondering, like again one of the professor from very renowned college, like when talking with him, like he said like information, like we are talking about like information / fake news also like comes out of the there are factories or it has large industry behind it. But like what I wanted to argue here was information is instant and it's a knowledge again which demands the labor. So demands the labor. It's not the information, like production of information.
Yes, yes,
So
yes. Right, right. We could talk a lot more about information. I mean, the fact that uh, they, the scientists developed a way of communication that made the question of meaning irrelevant. That's something quite extraordinary, yeah, because all communication had obsessed over the problem of language, translation, and you've got this guy who comes along, who say, it absolutely does not matter at all. Without respect to language and meaning, questions of noise can be modulated and dealt with on a purely technical basis. That was something that could not have been foreseen. Yeah, and what it has led to, as you I think correctly say, is a drowning of information in our, amidst our ability to conceptualize, formulate, take away knowledge. So the bottleneck. So now there is a bottleneck. The bottleneck is attention economy. We are only able to absorb a certain amount of information, and the challenge is to catch the attention. So in a way, the battle shifts from trying to get your information out and circulated to doing something to catch your attention, at which people like Donald Trump are masters. Say, I will buy Greenland. Now, whatever else you're doing, you'll pay attention to that. Simply speaking, to do violence to your assumptions, to do violence to your understanding, that catches your attention. Yeah, so to do actual violence, that will also catch your attention. So there's an increasing demand for various forms of violence, symbolic violence, real violence, that would be sure to catch attention. Yeah, because that's in a way how we are programmed. Yeah, dog bites man, not man bites dog, not dog bites man. That kind of news. Yeah, so and that in a way helps to fulfill Marx's prophecy in Communist Manifesto. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, all that is sacred is rendered trivial, or I forget what the exact word is. Yeah, no, so the desecration or the violation or the destruction of our symbol systems is something that we have begun to cooperate in, because that's part of the attention getting culture that we are actually inculcated into. That's one argument you can make. It's not the only thing going on, but we can observe that this is going on. Yeah?
The dematerialization and deculturalization of information, if we have to trace back the genealogy of the whole process, we could trace it to Claude Shannon's
Yes.
theory of communication.
Yes, that's.
Of course, greatly helped the computer technology.
Yeah.
But the fact that, the communication scholars, certainly the American scholarship, had taken it and then put it up, it completely dematerialized the question of the question of context,
Yes,
the question
yes.
of culture.
Yes.
Took a backseat. Increased.
Yes. Now here I find that Claude Shannon and Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener had a more deep philosophical understanding of what the problems were. Shannon was more technical, and what Norbert Wiener pointed out was that according to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe is constantly winding down. We're losing energy, and losing energy in the sense that not able to maintain the energy is constantly being degraded, put it that way. It's being degraded so that the system cannot have the same integrity that it used to have. Now, thanks to the research of Leo Szilard, Hungarian physicist, whose work Norbert Wiener draws upon, what Szilard found out was that information can be converted into energy under certain conditions, yeah, and that in a sense the use of information can be made to reverse energy loss in a limited extent, on a limited basis. Yeah, and so Norbert Wiener uses that to argue we can utilize structured forms of information flow to preserve, to limit the loss of entropy, essentially that. And that is the human task. Our human instinct is to conserve our environment and to preserve it and to make it durable and sustainable. He is giving a very specific meaning to that by saying this is what happens with information that allows us to limit entropy. Yeah? So for that reason I think Wiener is very helpful. Okay, right. All right, yeah. See you soon.